We don't know why some of our ancestors did the things they did. We are frequently impressed by the scale of their accomplishments, but we're mystified about why or even how they created certain artifacts, structures, and even whole cities. There are times when no amount of study or investigation can unlock all of the secrets of discovery, and when that happens, we get to make fantastic videos like this one. Let's go! Bezoars are both beautiful and disgusting at the same time. You wouldn't know they're disgusting just by looking at them, though. They look like beautiful jewelry and were worn as such by Persian and Greek rulers hundreds of years ago. Underneath all the gilding and decoration, though, bezoars are made from the indigestible materials that get left behind in the guts of animals when they die. In some cases, bezoars were even made from the gut material of dead humans. The ancient Persians believed bezoars to have medicinal benefits and sometimes ground them up and mixed them into drinks. The Greeks saw them more as decorative objects, although that might be because they didn't actually know how they were made. It's thought that Greek royals bought them under the impression that they were crystallized tears of deer or other such fanciful ideas. Bezoars were the height of fashion in the 16th century, to the extent where even Queen Elizabeth I of England is known to have worn a small one as a ringstone. They eventually fell out of fashion about 200 years later when people finally became wise to their true nature. Our next discovery takes us to a Buddhist temple in Nanjing, China. To be more specific, it takes us to a crypt beneath the temple, where archaeologists discovered a gold chest in 2016. Inside the casket was a collection of bones. Most of the bones are said to be those of Buddhist saints, but one of them, a parietal bone from a human skull, is believed to have belonged to the Buddha himself, Siddhartha Gautama. The chest is made from sandalwood, elaborately decorated with both silver and gold, and is around 1,000 years old. As if the gold and silver weren't enough, it's also covered in glass, crystal, agate, and lapis lazuli gemstones. Helpfully, it also bears inscriptions telling us that it was made during the reign of Emperor Shenzong, which began in the year 997 and ended in 1022. It would be impossible to prove that the skull bone belongs to the Buddha, but the monks who are responsible for guarding it inside the modern-day Chichia temple treat it as a genuine relic. By the time the chest was made, the Buddha would have been dead for over 1,000 years. Legends say that his cremated remains were divided into over 84,000 pieces. Perhaps this is one of those pieces. Archaeologists and historians know that when the Celts went into battle, they always brought a carnix or two with them. What they don't know is why or what function the carnix served. Very few surviving examples of the item have ever been found, but one was discovered a few years ago in Tintignac, France. The artifact is around 2,300 years old and made from beaten bronze. In both form and function, it looks a little like a trumpet, so it was most likely used as a musical instrument. Every carnix that's been found to date has one end shaped like the head of an animal. The French one has a wolf's head, but other examples have the head of a serpent or a bird instead. The Tintignac carnix is unlike all the others because it contains a straight tube. That would have made it impossible to play the instrument vertically, which is the way it's depicted in ancient artworks. It could be played horizontally, but that would be impractical on a battlefield. Perhaps the purposes the instrument served weren't confined to combat after all. Moving on to more recent discoveries, archaeologists in Egypt discovered a vast collection of ancient artifacts in Saqqara in January 2021, and still aren't totally sure what to make of them. The discoveries were made inside a funerary temple and included miniature wooden caskets, tiny figurines, and a fragment of the Book of the Dead. The temple is dedicated to Queen Niaret, the wife of the pharaoh King Teti. Both it and the puzzling relics are about 3,000 years old. There are 50 of the small wooden coffins in total, each of which is decorated with carvings of the gods of ancient Egypt, and delicately inscribed passages from the Book of the Dead. The findings wouldn't be so unusual if they weren't so small. Nothing like this has ever been found in a funerary temple in Egypt before. It's likely that the figurines are supposed to represent something, perhaps servants to tend to the queen's needs in the afterlife. There's been a significant increase in the number of archaeological digs carried out in Egypt in recent years, so there might be more discoveries like this in the near future to give this one some context. Speaking of remarkable things found in tombs, our next find comes from a tomb that was discovered on the outskirts of Beijing, China, in December 2021. It's a bronze-lidded vessel, and it dates back to the Western Shao dynasty of 3,000 years ago. A similar vessel was found at a burial site near here during the 1970s, so it's possible that the two artifacts are connected. Vessels like these are known as gui-type vessels, easily identified by their wide mouths and ringed bases. They were used to store food, but this particular gui vessel might have served a grander purpose. The inscription on its surface contains the character Yang, which refers specifically to the establishment of a new settlement or city. It's therefore possible that the person buried in the tomb had something to do with the founding of a city in this part of China 3,000 years ago. In other words, the vessel might be a relic from the earliest days of Beijing. More archaeological context will need to be found before that can be confirmed. Knowing the name of the person in the tomb would be a good start. Let's go from talking about things found inside tombs to talking about entire tombs. We're staying in China, and we're talking about the tomb of the third emperor of the Western Han Dynasty. The 2,000-year-old tomb, which is in Xi'an, was identified in December 2021, but it was actually discovered several decades earlier. It's only thanks to recent archaeological breakthroughs and improvements in our understanding of ancient China that we can say with confidence this is the final resting place of Emperor Wen. Until 2021, it was known simply as the Jiangkun grave. The difficulties with identifying it stem from the fact that it doesn't have a mound, so it's hard to identify it as a tomb from the outside. Since archaeologists returned to the tomb, they found no fewer than 110 satellite pits arranged around it, containing over 1,500 individual artifacts, like bronze seals, pottery figurines, and small bronze replicas of chariots and horses. It's a fantastic discovery, but we're left wondering how so many pits could have been missed by archaeologists for all these years. Understanding the customs of an ancient civilization is always difficult, but it's made even harder if the culture didn't have a written language. Take the Chankay, for example, who lived in parts of South America that now belong to Peru some 1,000 years ago. They lived there for more than 4 centuries before they lost their land to the Inca. The Inca did a good job of destroying their buildings and monuments, so the few Chankay artifacts we've been able to recover have mostly come from their graves. The most puzzling of those artifacts are the Chankay burial dolls. They're incredibly intricate, made from woven fabrics and then stuffed full of reeds to help them maintain their shape. They even have individual woven garments. If it weren't for the fact that they had such terrifying faces, they'd probably look quite cute. In Western cultures, we give stuffed toys to children. Historians aren't sure whether these dolls were given to the Chankay when they were young and then kept for their whole lives, or whether they were created specifically for burials. If it's the latter, they may have been intended to become companions for the dead in the afterlife. We sometimes still struggle to understand the burial customs of an ancient grave, even when they had a written language and were able to comprehend it. We know a lot about the ancient Egyptians, but we've never got to grips with the purpose of their funerary cones. Most funerary cones come from the Theban necropolis, although there are a handful of examples that have been found elsewhere. In every case, the cones are made from mud taken from the banks of the Nile. The Egyptians could have found and used mud from anywhere, so the selection of mud from the Nile must have been symbolically important. On the flat base of each cone is a stamp bearing the name of the tomb's occupant, along with any official titles or ranks they might have held. A typical placement for a funerary cone would be above its entrance, or on an outer wall approaching the entrance. The name of a tomb's occupant is written in many other places in and around a tomb, so there was no need to go to so much trouble to make another object purely to identify them. The cones must have had another purpose, but we can't imagine what it was. We've had a couple of Egyptian discoveries in this video, but there's always room for one more. Let's talk about the Abydos boats. They're so named because they were found in the desert of Abydos, a long way from the banks of the Nile. That's a strange place to find a fleet of boats. But then again, these boats were never designed to sail on water. That makes it a little controversial to call them boats, because if we class them as such, they automatically become some of the oldest boats in the world, with an age of approximately 5,000 years. Their purpose is uncertain, but many historians have noticed how closely they resemble the small model boats that were found inside the tomb of Tutankhamun in the 1920s. Based on that, it's possible that they're solar boats. In Egyptian mythology, solar boats were the method of transport that carried Ra, the sun god, across the sky each day. Going a little further with that theory, burying a fleet of solar boats next to the tomb of a pharaoh might have been a way of providing the king or queen with a means of traveling through the heavens after death. The issue here is that no tomb has been discovered anywhere near the Abydos boats, leaving us without an explanation. The Folkton drums were found in the grave of a child in the village of Folkton, Yorkshire, England in 1889. They've been a mystery ever since, but the mystery might finally have been solved. Calling the artifacts drums is a little misleading. There are 3 of the cylindrical objects, all of which are made from solid chalk and elaborately decorated with carved symbols. Tests carried out in 2015 showed that the markings may have been added several centuries after the cylinders were first carved 4,600 years ago. The practice of burying people with grave goods in the British Isles is thought to have begun about 5,000 years ago, so examples of British grave goods don't come much older than this. One of the drums was positioned behind the child's head, and the other 2 were on either side of its hips. If the findings of the 2015 tests are accurate, the grave must have been dug up, after which the inscriptions were added, and then both the remains and the drums were reburied. We have no idea why anyone would do that, but then we have no idea what purpose they served to begin with. The Shroud of Turin is revered as a Christian relic, even though it's been scientifically proven to have nothing to do with the death of Jesus Christ. The Shroud of Oviedo isn't anywhere near as celebrated a Christian relic, even though it's far more likely to have a tangible connection to the life of Jesus Christ. The shroud is little more than a strip of cloth stained with blood. It's stored and protected inside the Cámara Santa in the Cathedral of San Salvador in Oviedo, Spain, and isn't on display to the public because it's incredibly fragile. The cloth is said to have been wrapped around the head of Jesus while he was on the cross, as referred to in John 26. The first historical record of its existence comes from the year 570, when it was noted to be under constant guard in a cave in Jerusalem in the writings of Antonius of Piacenza. As residents of Jerusalem fled the advancing Persians in 616, the shroud found its way to Spain. Carbon dating tests carried out on the shroud suggests that the cloth was woven during the 7th century. But that can't be true because there's documentary evidence of its existence before that point. The dating discrepancy is unexplained. Accidental discoveries often make for the best stories, and this is a great one. A sugarcane plantation worker in Colombia got the shock of his life in 1992 when the ground opened up in front of him, and his tractor plunged into a hole in the ground. He survived the fall with bumps and bruises, and was still counting his blessings at the bottom of the hole when he realized he was surrounded by golden treasure. He knew he should alert the authorities, but instead he pocketed some of the smaller items and sold them privately. He also told a few of his friends about the discovery, and they told their other friends. Before long, hundreds of people descended on the site and started digging. This event is now known as the Malagana Gold Rush, and the hoard is known as the Malagana Treasure. Some, but certainly not all, of the treasures were eventually recovered. It's feared that some were melted down so they could be sold as gold without being recognized. It's now thought that the relics were made by and belonged to the Kalima culture, who lived in Colombia 2,000 years ago. We know almost nothing about them, other than that they were clearly very skilled at working with gold and silver. Subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, and enjoy watching new videos on my channel. Thanks for watching, and see you soon!